The city was a relentless machine, all concrete and neon, chewing up the young and the weary. But tonight, the engine of its industry seemed to be grinding Lily down specifically. She moved through the late-night streets of the financial district like a ghost, propelled only by the acidic burn of 3 cups of weak coffee and the sheer terror of failing the final exams looming just days away. Her existence was a delicate balancing act. Textbooks stained with spilled ramen, 3 part-time jobs that devoured her hours, and the constant, crushing weight of tuition fees hanging over her head. She lived on the fringes of the promised land, close enough to smell the wealth she couldn't touch, yet determined to earn her way into stability. The library's fluorescent glow had been her only sun for 16 straight, grueling hours. Tonight, the exhaustion felt deeper than physical fatigue. It was a psychological drain that blurred her vision and made the towering skyscrapers swim, turning solid reality into liquid uncertainty. She clutched the worn strap of her heavy canvas backpack, its contents a physical metaphor for her immense burden. Dense philosophy texts detailing abstract concepts of freedom, juxtaposed with the crinkled foil of stale, utilitarian energy bars. She desperately needed the sanctuary of her friend Maya's beat-up sedan. Her temporary reprieve before the next dawn forced her back into the cycle. The designated late-night pickup spot, tucked awkwardly between a chic, minimalist art gallery and the imposing stone facade of an international bank, always felt wrong. A harsh collision of her lived poverty with their untouchable wealth. A car pulled up, silent and obsidian black, gliding to a stop by the curb. It reflected the cold streetlights like a polished, empty tombstone. In her state of profound mental and physical depletion, the silhouette of the low-slung vehicle and the quick, practiced flick of the passenger door latch registered in her mind only as relief. Her fatigued consciousness supplied the necessary identity, Maya. She didn't pause to register the car's sleek, unfamiliar lines or the unnerving silence of its approach. With a sigh that seemed to carry the entire weight of her academic year and her financial stress, she simply collapsed onto the leather seat, pulling the heavy door shut and sinking instantly into the luxurious, alien quiet. Her head tipped immediately toward the window, seeking oblivion. The air in the car, however, was wrong. It was thick, sterile, and intensely cold, scented not with the familiar chaos of cheap air freshener, old textbook paper, and spilled coffee that defined Maya's vehicle, but with something sharp, a scent of expensive, imported cologne, a trace of metallic iron, and a profound, silent, terrible authority. Lily's eyes snapped open, tearing her from the brink of exhaustion. This was not her friend's familiar mess. The interior was sculpted darkness, all brushed aluminum and flawless, black stitching, suggesting a world constructed entirely for power and concealment. Slowly, her gaze moved toward the driver. He was a creature carved from shadow and unforgiving, stark angles. Damien Moretti. His name was a whispered legend in the city's underbelly, synonymous with absolute control and icy ruthlessness. Even in the imperfect gloom of the streetlights filtering through the tinted glass, his reputation preceded him, radiating from his stillness and posture like a palpable, physical force. His profile was stark, unsettlingly beautiful, and utterly lethal. A quiet dread, cold and instantaneous, replaced the warmth of fatigue in Lily's veins. This was a man whose very presence demanded silence, whose eyes, currently fixed with terrifying focus on the road ahead, held the unsettling, calm certainty of a predator who had just realized his quarry had delivered itself directly to his den. He did not speak a single word. He didn't need to. The heavy vehicle began to move, smoothly and quickly, gliding away from the familiar curbside of Lily's exhausting, predictable life and accelerating into the labyrinthine darkness of a world she only knew through terrifying rumors and hushed warnings. The mistake was now compounded, sealed. She was a trespasser, locked in a confined space with the very force the city feared. Every sense screamed that her continued survival was dependent entirely on the unknowable whim of the powerful, merciless man beside her. This was not merely a wrong turn. It was the abrupt crossing of an irreversible, dangerous threshold, where the acceptable currency was not dollars or academic grades, but unwavering loyalty, and the penalty for accidental intrusion was always, devastatingly, absolute. The cold realization settled deep in her core. Her desperate quest for routine survival had inadvertently brought her to the heart of true peril, binding her small, fragile life to the magnetic, terrifying force that was Damien Moretti. Part 2: Trials of Faith and Resilience. The journey quickly left the city's brightly lit arteries for the hidden, shadow-choked veins of the metropolis. Lily, paralyzed by the sheer gravity of her error, struggled to reclaim the simple ability to breathe normally. Her initial instinct, to scramble for the door handle, was stifled by the driver's unyielding stillness, a silent, powerful warning that movement would be a greater danger than submission. Damien, a man rumored to execute calculated risks with surgical precision, offered no verbal acknowledgement of her presence, yet the air between them vibrated with his complete awareness of her every involuntary twitch and breath. This forced proximity became her first trial, enduring the suffocating tension of occupying space with pure, unadulterated danger. They eventually arrived not at a mansion of overt luxury, but at a fortress of subtle, impenetrable defense. A penthouse atop one of the city's most anonymous and exclusive towers. She was ushered, not roughly, but with an economy of motion that brooked no resistance, through steel-reinforced doors and into an apartment that felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude command center. The panorama outside was staggering, yet Lily only saw the vast distance separating her from her former life. Her deepest struggle, the refusal of the call, was not external, but internal. Every rational part of her mind screamed for escape, demanded a logical explanation of her mistake, and an immediate return to the safety of her dilapidated dorm room. Yet, the paralyzing terror was interwoven with a strange, unwilling curiosity. Damien's world was a stark, brutal contrast to her own, yet it possessed a clarity and decisiveness that her chaotic, debt-ridden life lacked. She was a scholar of philosophy, accustomed to dissecting motivations. Now she was trapped, forced to study the motivations of a genuine killer. She held on to the simple resilience she had honed through years of poverty, the ability to assess a threat and conserve energy, transforming her fear into an intense, quiet observation. An intermediary appeared, a man named Marcus, whose eyes carried a weary intelligence, suggesting he had seen too much and judged nothing. Marcus served as the meeting with the mentor, though his guidance was wrapped in cryptic warnings rather than comfort. He brought her necessities, simple food, a thick, expensive blanket, and communicated the essential rule: survive by becoming invisible. Her life, he conveyed without speaking a single direct threat, rested entirely on her ability to integrate without disrupting the delicate balance of the cold world she had stumbled into. He did not offer rescue, but rather the crucial tool for immediate survival: the ability to read the subtle signals of the predator. Lily understood then that she was not just a mistake. She was a variable in Damien's meticulously controlled equation, and her only path was to learn the mathematics of his ruthlessness. Part 3: Turning Point: Irreversible Change. Days dissolved into a strange, distorted routine within the confines of the penthouse, which became her golden cage. Lily was kept isolated but not imprisoned in the conventional sense. Damien rarely interacted with her directly, yet his presence was a constant, heavy shadow across her peripheral vision. She observed him in the distance, conducting swift, brutal business with hushed voices and intense gestures, his authority absolute and chilling. She began to see the cracks in the monolithic facade of his power, witnessing moments of intense solitude, a depth of exhaustion that mirrored her own, albeit stemming from a far darker source. The irreversible turning point arrived during a raid, a violent external intrusion into the fortress that shattered the fragile illusion of safety. It was swift and terrifying. The usual cold calm of the apartment exploded into chaos, shouts, shattering glass, and the visceral sound of confrontation. Lily, hiding instinctively, witnessed Damien in action. It was not mere violence. It was controlled, efficient, lethal protection of his domain. In the terrifying rush, her hidden vulnerability became his sudden, unplanned responsibility. As the immediate threat subsided, Damien found her trembling, clutching the philosophy textbook she had clung to since the start. Instead of the expected ruthlessness, he reacted with an unexpected, almost subconscious protective instinct. He moved her physically, decisively, to a safer section of the apartment. In that brief, involuntary moment of shared danger, a hidden truth was revealed. Damien Moretti, the cold engine of violence, was also a being capable of instinctive defense of the weak, a twisted echo of courage. This proximity of shared trauma, the scent of gunpowder lingering in the air, forced Lily to cross the final threshold. She realized she could not return to her old life untainted, not after witnessing death and survival at this level. The sheer scale of what she now knew, the secrets, the power structures, the specific vulnerabilities of this ruthless empire, made her a permanent liability, and therefore, paradoxically, a permanent fixture. She chose, not with relief, but with grim acceptance, to cease viewing herself as a captive and start viewing herself as a survivor embedded within a hostile ecosystem, making an irrevocable commitment to navigate this new, perilous world. Part 4. The Test: Moral Dilemmas. The dynamic shifted from captive and captor to something dangerously indefinable, the test of proximity under extreme duress. Damien, recognizing her resilience and unusual observational skills, began to use her silence as an unspoken sounding board, a void into which he could occasionally drop fragments of his burdensome reality. He never asked for advice, only for the presence of a mind unconnected to his web of power. Lily faced escalating tests, allies, and enemies. Her greatest test was the erosion of her moral certainties. She witnessed acts of severe cruelty, yet she also saw Damien allocate vast, silent resources to protect innocent people caught in the crossfire of his wars. She struggled with the moral dilemma of judging the architect of protection who was also the master of destruction. She found an unexpected, silent ally in Marcus, the intermediary, who, seeing her quiet resilience, began to provide subtle warnings. A lifted eyebrow, a slight hesitation, that helped her avoid dangerous situations or interpret Damien's volatile moods. The enemies were external, rival families, informants, but the deeper adversary was within the compound. A lieutenant named Ronaldo, whose distrust of Lily was immediate and visceral. Ronaldo saw her as a contamination, a weakness in Damien's carefully constructed armor. Ronaldo's veiled hostility became a constant source of tension, pushing Lily to demonstrate courage not through defiance, but through stillness and unflappable observation. She began to understand that Damien was not purely evil. He was a man trapped by a terrifying legacy, ruling by necessity in a world that allowed no softness. This realization intensified the danger, as the line between her fear and a grudging, complex human connection blurred. Her core value of compassion was tested, finding itself struggling to breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of ruthlessness. Part 5. The Revelation Cathartic Climax. The central conflict arrived swiftly, fueled by Ronaldo's escalating jealousy and a devastating strategic failure in Damien's organization. Ronaldo, believing Lily was the source of Damien's newly introduced hesitations, orchestrated a situation designed to expose her and, simultaneously, damage Damien's influence. This was the approach to the inmost cave, a descent into the heart of the crisis. The crisis unfolded during a high-stakes, clandestine meeting intended to resolve a crucial territory dispute. Ronaldo subtly leaked information, ensuring the meeting was ambushed. Lily, using the observational skills Marcus had inadvertently cultivated, realized the trap just moments before it sprung. She did not flee. Instead, driven by the complex web of fear and nascent protection she felt for Damien, a man who had, against all odds, preserved her life, she made the decisive choice. She triggered the building's emergency security lockdown sequence, throwing the ambush into immediate disarray. This moment was the ordeal, a sacrificial act, placing her directly in the line of fire, utilizing the subtle technology of Damien's world to protect him from his own internal treachery. The resulting confrontation was explosive, culminating in Damien confronting Ronaldo and the external attackers simultaneously. Lily, hiding but instrumental, witnessed Damien's true depth of commitment, not to violence, but to control and the preservation of his remaining honor. When the chaos finally subsided, Damien stood victorious, but severely damaged. Lily emerged not as a helpless student, but as an indispensable part of his survival. The reward, seizing the sword, was not freedom, but a profound shift in status and understanding. Damien looked at her, a long, agonizing gaze stripped of its usual icy control, and saw not the mistake that stumbled into his car, but the unexpected, fierce protector who had risked everything to save him. The central message solidified. True allegiance and connection could be forged not in comfort, but in shared, life-altering terror. All major subplots, Lily's integration, Marcus's quiet support, Ronaldo's betrayal, culminated in this brutal, defining moment, reinforcing that compassion, even in the darkest corners, could be a weapon. Part 6. The Aftermath, Lingering Consequences. The immediate aftermath was shrouded in the clinical silence of recovery. Damien was injured, physically and strategically shaken by the betrayal. Lily, though physically intact, was permanently scarred by the raw brutality she had witnessed and participated in. The luxury penthouse now carried the phantom scent of smoke and blood, a permanent reminder of the violence inherent in their shared existence. The denouement explored the transformation of their relationship. The fear was replaced by an intense, silent bond forged in mutual life-saving actions. Lily no longer saw Damien as merely the mafia boss. She saw the wounded, burdened ruler. He, in turn, saw her not as a liability, but as a pure source of unexpected courage and intellect, untainted by the moral rot of his world. Their shared trauma became a new, dangerous foundation. This was the road back, but the road was internal. Lily realized she could never truly go back to her simple college life. She now carried the weight of terrible knowledge. The scars were psychological, the knowledge of how swiftly life could be ended, and how profoundly she was capable of acting under pressure. Her ambition for academic survival had been replaced by a fierce, practical commitment to emotional survival alongside a man whose existence was constantly threatened. She was permanently changed, her quiet dignity now tempered by a pragmatic ruthlessness born of necessity. She started integrating her knowledge of philosophy, the ethics of necessity, the calculus of sacrifice, into the immediate, perilous reality of Damien's world, transforming herself from an academic observer into a crucial, silent advisor. Part 7. The Legacy Transcendent Conclusion. The final movement of their shared journey centered on integration and transcendence. The world they inhabited was still dangerous, but their shared position within it was now secured by mutual respect and a burgeoning, unexpected love that was silent, watchful, and fierce. The resurrection came in the form of a final, symbolic test. Damien had to consolidate his power after the attempt on his life, facing a council of old, suspicious figures who doubted his strength due to his injuries and his unusual attachment to the outsider. Lily, standing silently beside him, offered no words, but her unwavering presence, her calm intellectual scrutiny of the council's maneuverings, traits Damien had learned to rely upon, provided the necessary unspoken reassurance of his stability and foresight. Her resilience, cultivated in dorm rooms and libraries, proved to be more formidable than brute force. She had successfully navigated his world not by becoming ruthless, but by mastering the art of controlled vulnerability and strategic loyalty. The conclusion offered a resonant closure, achieving safety not through escape, but through mastery of the environment. Lily had earned her place, not as a lover or a captive, but as the quiet conscience and strategic anchor to the powerful man beside her. She had not reformed the darkness entirely, but she had brought a solitary light to its very center, a transformation based on the universal value of love recognizing hidden worth. The return with the elixir was symbolic. Lily did not return to the university had come to her. She carried the wisdom of extremity, understanding that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Her legacy was the profound lesson she had imparted to Damien, that control born purely of cold isolation was fragile, but control reinforced by fierce, selfless human connection was unbreakable. They were bound by the truth that their love, born of terrifying accident, was the only thing capable of surviving the relentless cost of his empire, providing a sense of hope and a deeper understanding that redemption often arrives packaged in the most terrifying, unexpected circumstances. The story closed on the image of two figures, standing on the precipice of a violent world, their hands never touching, yet their lives irrevocably, profoundly merged by the resilience of the human heart. The aftermath of the ambush did not settle into peaceful stasis. Rather, it became a phase of calculated, intensive recovery, demanding subtle but profound changes in the operational rhythm of the organization. Damien, confined temporarily by the gravity of his wounds, began delegating duties that he had previously held with fierce singularity. This necessity introduced a novel dynamic into their confined environment. The slow, deliberate intrusion of shared administrative labor, moving beyond mere survival toward collaborative governance. Now, the silent philosophy student became an intrinsic part of the command structure, her task being the meticulous, almost archaeological sorting of fragmented information flowing into the penthouse, assessing loyalty tiers and discerning operational noise from critical data. Indeed, the shifting landscape exposed an acute vulnerability in the organization's communication protocols. Lily, observing the cascading failures of encrypted messaging and redundant verbal confirmations, proposed a system modeled not on the hierarchy of command, but on the principles of decentralized information mapping, a concept gleaned from her forgotten studies of ancient societal structures. She designed a complex, layered verification process, one that utilized abstract pattern recognition rather than simple passwords, making the internal network a labyrinth impervious to brute force intrusion. Conversely, Damien's realization of her practical genius was marked by a chilling formality. He didn't praise her, but simply acted upon her recommendations instantly and without question, granting her an unprecedented operational clearance. Furthermore, this new proximity, forced by professional necessity, peeled away another layer of Damien's enigmatic distance. One evening, reviewing complex financial ledger entries riddled with inconsistencies, Lily encountered a pattern that suggested not theft, but desperate, mismanaged aid flowing into a dilapidated children's hospital on the city's forgotten East Side. She presented the evidence with careful neutrality, separating the fact of the misallocation from any moral judgment. The ensuing silence was heavy, not with anger, but with a profound, almost painful weariness. Damien revealed, not through explanation but through a simple, fleeting glance at a hidden photograph, the root of this obscured subplot, a debt of tragic, inherited obligation to the city's most vulnerable. This glimpse into his concealed motives, a cold exterior shielding a fiercely protected, utilitarian compassion, deepened the emotional entanglement far beyond the initial, adrenaline-fueled protection. Another crucial layer emerged during her attempts to maintain connection with her former world. Marcus, recognizing her need for grounding, subtly facilitated the transfer of her crucial academic materials. Lily received a heavy box containing her remaining textbooks, research notes, and, unexpectedly, a framed photograph of her family. Looking at the image of her past, clean and orderly, she felt not longing, but a peculiar detachment. She understood that her current existence, fraught with peril and ethical compromise, offered a far greater sense of purpose and intellectual challenge than the sterile pursuit of academic accreditation. The contrast was stark, the theoretical pursuit of truth versus the visceral application of strategic necessity. Consequently, she abandoned her original trajectory with a deliberate sense of liberation rather than defeat. Her final, symbolic break involved sending a brief, carefully worded message to her university, a formal, irrevocable withdrawal. This act affirmed her commitment to the world she had accidentally chosen, recognizing that the lessons learned within the penthouse's tense atmosphere were far more demanding and real than any syllabus could offer. The price of this profound self-actualization was the isolation from normalcy, yet the reward was a partnership built on genuine, tested respect, cementing her role as the organization's silent, indispensable pivot point. She had not only survived the abyss but had found within it a demanding, undeniable reality where her intellect held tangible, life-saving power. The atmosphere within the penthouse, once defined by sheer terror, gradually evolved into a highly specialized environment of intense, shared solitude. This shift demanded new forms of resilience from Lily. Her initial survival strategy focused on invisibility. Her current requirement was strategic visibility, navigating the fine line between being a trusted asset and a vulnerable target. She began to catalog the subtle psychological costs of Damien's leadership, observing the emotional calcification that constant, absolute power demanded. He was a sentinel forever standing guard, rarely allowing himself the luxury of even minor physical relaxation, a habit that spoke volumes about the relentless pressure he endured. Moreover, her engagement deepened when she identified a pattern of manipulation being executed by a rival faction, utilizing complex market maneuvers to destabilize one of Damien's legitimate enterprises. This wasn't a violent attack, but a sophisticated, slow-motion strangulation via financial instruments. Lily's academic background, particularly in economic theory and game theory, unexpectedly armed her. She recognized the structure as a classic prisoner's dilemma applied to corporate acquisitions, noting the specific incentive structure designed to compel a subordinate manager to betray Damien's confidence for perceived personal gain. In response, Lily devised a countermeasure that bypassed brute force entirely. Rather than confronting the corporate spy, she designed a series of preemptive informational releases, controlled leaks of strategically inaccurate, yet plausible internal forecasts that would systematically invalidate the rival's entire investment strategy, turning their calculated risk into a guaranteed liability. The elegance of this solution lay in its non-violent efficiency. It neutralized the enemy's resources without bloodshed, proving that the mind could be a more devastating weapon than any firearm. Damien watched her execute this intellectual defense with a quiet, profound assessment, acknowledging the unparalleled value of foresight over reaction. Building upon this success, their working relationship crystallized into a complex symbiosis. Damien provided the necessary infrastructure and the ultimate authority, while Lily supplied the necessary intellectual distance, the ability to view the conflict from a detached, theoretical perspective unimpeded by the grudges and inherited limitations of his world. She realized that Damien had been trapped by historical precedent, fighting modern battles with archaic emotional strategies. She, conversely, introduced an analytical clarity, treating organized crime not as a moral struggle, but as a solvable, extremely high-stakes logistical puzzle. Now, consider the personal toll of this intellectual immersion. The constant requirement to think several moves ahead, to anticipate betrayal and mitigate catastrophe, began to erode her capacity for simple, unguarded existence. The sensory details of her old life, the smell of freshly cut grass, the casual ease of a shared joke, seemed impossibly distant and naive. Her dreams were no longer about finals or tuition, but sharp, vivid simulations of contingency plans. This pervasive hypervigilance was the unseen cost of her partnership, demonstrating that resilience in this environment was less about endurance and more about the fundamental alteration of one's perception of safety. Consequently, she encountered a moment of unexpected, profound connection one damp afternoon while observing Damien in a rare moment of unguarded reflection, looking out over the rain-slicked city. He was reviewing a file on a potential informant who was offering to sacrifice years of loyalty for a chance at a new life in a different continent. Lily, without conscious thought, approached the vast window. She did not speak, but placed a single polished stone, a smooth river rock she had kept in her backpack from her time near a remote coast, on the cold marble sill beside him. It was a silent acknowledgement of the weight of the moment, the universal desire for escape, and the inherent difficulty of forgiveness. The stone served as a metaphor for permanence in a world defined by transactional ephemerality. Damien reached out, his hand hovering over the cool, foreign surface, a fleeting moment where the coldness of his control yielded to a complex, internal recognition of her empathetic silent gesture, reinforcing the truth that their connection was anchored in mutual understanding of inescapable constraints, not shared ideology. The pressure upon the organization intensified, emanating not from a direct, hostile strike, but from the insidious leakage of institutional memory. This newest threat, highly sophisticated, manifested as a creeping erosion of historical security protocols, suggesting a mole deeply embedded and operating with chilling precision. This adversary was abstract, a phantom lifting secrets from the digital archives without leaving a trace of physical entry, yet the consequences were devastating. Years of meticulously gathered intelligence were suddenly exposed to the chilling light of their rivals. Damien realized he faced an enemy who valued ancient history as much as current power, demanding a defensive strategy that transcended mere physical fortification. In direct contrast to past violent confrontations, this conflict hinged entirely on intellectual triage. Lily discovered the source was a junior archivist named Elias, an anomaly within the network, a man who meticulously cataloged data but possessed an ethical compass far too fragile for this dark world. Elias was not a traitor motivated by greed, but a victim of ruthless emotional blackmail. His compromised position stemmed from an external threat leveraging his deepest, most intimate family vulnerabilities. The terrible moral calculus was laid bare for Lily. Elias, essentially an innocent man trapped by circumstances, posed a fatal systemic risk. His continuation meant the collapse of Damien's strategic advantage and the inevitable, bloody counter-retaliation that would engulf hundreds. The weight of this realization settled upon Lily with crushing physical finality. The high-altitude air of the penthouse, usually sterile and cold, seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest until breathing became a conscious, laborious effort. She endured nights of relentless wakefulness, staring at the vast, impersonal sprawl of the cityscape, grappling with the stark philosophical precipice. How did systemic survival, the preservation of an empire built on violence, justify the deliberate, calculated sacrifice of a single, morally pure entity? Her academic grounding in ethics provided no comfort, offering only theoretical distinctions between passive harm and active decision. She recognized that true, operational courage was not bravery in combat, but the cold capacity to embrace necessary moral contamination. Consequently, the moment arrived when she had to present her counsel. She stood before Damien not as an analyst, but as a judge delivering a verdict she herself knew was spiritually destructive. She recommended the complete, immediate, and permanent severance of Elias from the network, advocating for a measure that would render him strategically inert, ensuring his sudden disappearance from all digital and physical locations was absolute. Her voice remained level, devoid of the tremor of personal remorse, yet her eyes communicated the profound, internal hemorrhage this choice inflicted. Damien, observing her contained devastation, registered the true cost of her commitment. He understood that she had just sacrificed a piece of her intrinsic humanity to secure their shared continuation. Building on this excruciating choice, Damien executed the recommended action with the clinical finality that was his nature. The ensuing silence after the decisive moment was heavier than any shout or explosion, a profound, chilling vacuum left by the deliberate excision of a human life from the collective consciousness. Lily had crossed the critical threshold. She was no longer merely observing the darkness. She was actively participating in the cold, transactional necessity of survival. The bond between her and Damien hardened instantly, cemented by the silent, dreadful knowledge of this shared ethical violation. This was the irrefutable commitment to the path, a covenant sealed not by affection or shared hope, but by the acceptance of mutual necessary guilt. Her transformation was complete. The student seeking security had been forged into an integral piece of the system, indelibly stained by the decisions required to keep the edifice standing. Now, she carried the responsibility of their empire's continued existence, a price paid in the currency of compromised conscience. The air in the secure data room, meticulously circulated and ozone-scrubbed, offered no relief from the intense spiritual toll her newest decisions demanded. Lily found that her senses, once acutely attuned to the subtle shifts in the human environment, were now fundamentally reorganized. She moved through the vast, silent apartment, its marble surfaces seemingly designed to absorb all sound, existing in a state of self-imposed emotional quarantine. The memory of her old life, the vibrant, intellectual chaos of the college campus, felt like observing a vivid, disconnected dream belonging to another person entirely. Her capacity for casual, unguarded empathy had become brittle, replaced by a cold, calculating objectivity that instinctively sorted human beings into binary categories of utility and systemic risk, an essential defense mechanism that nonetheless left a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. Furthermore, Damien's demonstration of his absolute trust was chillingly pragmatic. He entrusted her with the oversight of the most sensitive asset management portfolios, requiring her to structure and supervise the subtle, daily machinations necessary to keep their legitimate financial engine running clean. This was no longer the theoretical engagement of a detached strategist. She had become the active custodian of immense wealth and deeply buried secrets, tasks that demanded the quiet, sophisticated coercion of powerful, compromised figures within the city's elite. Building on this operational mandate, she spent countless hours in the subterranean vault, a sterile space lined with servers humming their constant electronic chorus. Here, she structured the training curriculum for the new intake of strategic analysts, a program fundamentally designed to teach them to prioritize institutional integrity and forward-looking stability over any momentary impulse of individual welfare. This curriculum represented a chilling, formalized translation of her recently acquired terrible wisdom into institutional policy. Consequently, while her power was undeniably consolidated, this elevation brought with it a fierce, undeniable isolation. Damien, convinced of her unwavering internal fortitude and strategic acuity, ceased offering the subtle, protective shields he had once instinctively deployed. Now, consider the profound shift in dynamic. She was expected to navigate the toxic jealousies and veiled, bureaucratic threats of the surviving internal lieutenants entirely on her own merit, standing exposed in the harsh light of her newly acquired authority. Marcus, the pragmatic intermediary, offered only a grave, silent nod during their infrequent passages in the hallway, a gesture that conveyed respect mixed with a profound, unspoken recognition of the permanence of her transformation. He treated her not as a fragile outlier, but as a hardened colleague, a warrior capable of inflicting necessary, procedural cruelty. Conversely, moments of profound, disorienting internal dissonance still managed to penetrate her meticulously controlled facade. Once, while observing the city's skyline from the shielded terrace, a landscape of glittering towers she now partially influenced, she noticed a flock of migrating birds momentarily confuse the tower's reflective glass for the open sky. Their sudden, disoriented scattering triggered a brief, sharp memory of her own initial, misguided, accidental entry into this world. This visual metaphor underscored the terrible irony of her position. She had gained undeniable power and control, yet she felt more trapped than ever before, now bound by the heavy chains of responsibility forged from their shared, necessary darkness. Her resilience was no longer a shield against external hardship. It was a heavy, exquisitely detailed armor worn specifically against the slow, inevitable freezing of her own emotional core. The existential question facing her had evolved. It was no longer about simply escaping, but about calculating precisely how much of her original self she could afford to sacrifice while ensuring the collective survival of the powerful, perilous world she now anchored. A direct consequence of her elevated standing was the gravitational pull of historical opposition. The sheer audacity of Damien relying on a non-family member, a scholar of abstracts, drew out figures who had long been dormant, viewing Lily not as a key asset, but as an existential impurity threatening the established order. One such entity was Ignazio Moretti, Damien's aging cousin, whose claim to influence rested solely on the fossilized codes of lineage. Ignazio's challenge was subtle, a campaign of corrosive doubt, whispered through established channels, questioning Damien's judgment and emotional capacity rather than his sheer force. This particular strain of pressure bypassed the secure digital firewalls Lily had erected, striking directly at the vulnerable cultural heart of the organization. To counter this spectral foe, Lily deployed her methodology in a completely new direction. She shifted her focus from cryptographic patterns to genealogical ones, immersing herself in the convoluted, ancient chronicles of the Moretti succession. She analyzed generations of familial resentments, treating feuds not as personal dramas but as structural weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Her deep dive into the archives, a process conducted in the isolated, climate-controlled basement library of the compound, revealed the precise historical grievances that Ignazio was pressing, old slights regarding asset distribution and perceived insults against his deceased brother. This exhaustive historical excavation revealed that the true vulnerability lay in Damien's intense, almost ritualistic loyalty to the memory of the past, a dedication that had blinded him to the present danger embodied by his opportunistic relative. The realization that his family history was being weaponized against him caused a profound, visceral distress in Damien, a human fracturing Lily had never witnessed. He rarely showed physical pain. This was something far deeper. One evening, she found him in the estate's secondary study, a room rarely used, lined with sepia-toned portraits and heavy, carved oak, a deliberate monument to the legacy that now threatened to consume him. His usual posture of impermeable control had utterly dissolved. He was staring at a faded photograph of his father, the mask of the formidable boss utterly gone, replaced by the deep, uncomplicated grief of a son struggling under an impossible inheritance. Seeing this raw, unmediated emotional pain was profoundly disorienting for Lily. It transcended their professional contract, forcing her to confront the man beneath the legend, the weary custodian of an inescapable, agonizing inheritance. This moment demanded a response that was neither tactical nor therapeutic, but purely stabilizing. Lily did not offer verbal solace or a strategic blueprint. Instead, she provided silent anchorage. Recognizing the symbolic weight of the space and the burden of history, she moved quietly toward the heavy mahogany desk. She placed a single, handwritten chart detailing Ignazio's current, vulnerable financial dependence, a roadmap of his exposure, on the corner of the blotter. It was an unspoken statement of fact. Honor the dead, but fight with the strategic weapons of the living. This simple, factual intrusion into his emotional space provided the necessary jolt. Damien looked up, his eyes sharp with the sudden, necessary return of calculated clarity, recognizing the profound distinction between destructive sentiment and life-preserving strategy. The emotional consequence was immediate and lasting. Their bond deepened, moving past strategic dependence into a quiet, mutual recognition of the exhausting demands of maintaining order in chaos. Lily understood that true power lay not in the ability to dominate, but in the capacity to endure profound personal loss while continuing to execute necessary, unpleasant action. Her presence, silent and intellectually unwavering, served as the definitive counterweight to the crushing inertia of his past. Now consider the final toll. She possessed the intellectual keys to his survival, but in doing so, she became the permanent witness to his most private, human weaknesses, ensuring her inability to ever truly separate herself from the heavy weight of the Moretti name. The environment that had once been Lily's accidental prison had long since transformed into a crucible, a silent chamber where two vastly disparate lives had been compressed under unimaginable heat and pressure. fusing into a single, complex unit of operational efficiency. The initial terror of the trespasser had yielded to the cold, necessary acceptance of the architect. She moved through the high-altitude silence of the command center not with the hesitant step of a guest, but with the quiet, inherent authority of one who understands the structural weaknesses of the edifice better than its original builders. Her presence was no longer an anomaly to be managed, but the precise counterweight to Damien's inherited darkness, the intellectual ballast stabilizing a ship perpetually listing in violent waters. The partnership, forged in shared peril and sealed by decisions of profound ethical weight, had stripped away the possibility of superficial existence for both of them. For Lily, the gain of strategic insight, the ability to see the world as a solvable algorithm of self-interest and defense, came at the irreversible cost of her capacity for easy idealism. She found herself existing in a constant state of calculated foresight, her mind operating moves ahead of the present moment, recognizing the true vulnerability not in physical weakness, but in the failure of absolute control. The sleek geometry of the penthouse, once an image of imposing wealth, now felt like a perfectly calibrated sensor array, where every silence was pregnant with potential threat, and every window offered a view of the enormous, chaotic world they were now obligated to tame or neutralize. Damien, too, was irrevocably altered by this proximity to uncompromising clarity. His isolation, once a source of formidable strength and protection, had revealed itself as his greatest operational flaw. He had, for years, fought the future using only the instruments and strategies of a punishing past, believing that tradition and force were the only currencies of survival. Lily's influence was the quiet introduction of modernity, the understanding that the most devastating conflicts are waged not with steel, but with information, leverage, and the strategic anticipation of psychological collapse. He relied upon her objective distance, the rare quality of counsel unclouded by the dense, suffocating history of his lineage. Reflecting on this journey so far, one sees the convergence of disparate paths not as a moment of softness, but as the inevitable alignment of two complex forces under the mandate of survival. Their existence together was the quiet, constant humming of a reactor, immensely powerful, contained only by sophisticated engineering, and always generating immense heat and risk. The emotional current running between them was not a gentle stream of affection, but the fierce, electrical charge generated by two individuals who had witnessed each other's deepest moral compromises and chosen, through silent acknowledgement, to build something unbreakable upon that shared, perilous foundation. The trials faced, from the smallest moral dilemma to the largest threat of annihilation, had prepared them for a reckoning that could not be solved by strategy alone. The external enemies and the internal betrayals were merely rehearsals for the ultimate confrontation, a final test that would measure not their capacity for ruthlessness, but the resilience of the quiet, unexpected covenant they had forged in the heart of the empire. They stood now at the precipice of the final act, armed with a powerful intimacy born not of desire, but of necessary, shared guilt and an intellectual synchronicity that felt like fate. The question remained whether this newly built, deeply rooted foundation could withstand the ultimate shock, the final consequence that demanded not just sacrifice of others, but the definitive expenditure of the self. The silence held the anticipation of that ultimate price. The high-altitude wind whipping around the penthouse terrace offered no solace, only the cold, unblinking mandate of the new reality. Lily stood beside Damien, gazing out at the vast, glittering grid of the city, a constellation of lights that was now not a map of hopeful possibility, but a complex territory of controlled threats. The sheer exhaustion of her journey, the transformation from a burdened academic to a strategic anchor, had settled into a profound, enduring stillness. She was no longer defined by the terror of her accidental entry, but by the intellectual rigor and moral fortitude she had demonstrated under duress. The simple act of breathing, once labored with fear, now felt like a measured, conscious choice to engage with the world, a subtle yet continuous declaration of unwavering presence. Their connection was a profound synthesis, an alloy forged not in romantic fire but in the intense, pragmatic heat of shared danger and necessary sacrifice. What had begun as a terrifying misalignment, a student slipping into the car of a sovereign of shadow, had evolved into an existential dependence. Damien had learned that absolute power, when isolated, becomes brittle, easily fractured by the internal rot of loyalty tested by greed. Lily brought the antidote, the cold, uncompromised clarity of an outsider, capable of seeing betrayal not as a personal slight, but as a solvable logistical equation. Their love, therefore, was a uniquely dangerous thing, rooted in mutual respect for competence and the silent, dreadful knowledge of the violence required to maintain their shared equilibrium. The cost of this ascendancy was visible in the absence of her easy laughter and the steel she now carried in her gaze. She bore the psychological scars of the difficult choices made in the data vault, the calculated removal of vulnerability, the necessary ethical compromises. Yet, the wisdom gained was the transcendent elixir, the understanding that true courage resides not in the idealistic pursuit of purity, but in the resilience required to choose the lesser evil when the systemic survival of many depends on the unavoidable contamination of one's own conscience. She had exchanged the abstract pursuit of philosophical truth for the immediate, brutal application of necessary ethics. Damien, observing her silent strength, recognized that she had granted him not just survival, but redemption, not from his dark past, which remained immutable, but from the crushing isolation of his role. Her presence was the singular truth in his life of manufactured deceptions. Their union was the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most profoundly human connections are forged in the very places designed to extinguish hope, proving that resilience is not merely about enduring hardship, but about finding a way to integrate the darkness into the foundation of strength. As the dawn began to break, painting the upper edges of the skyscrapers in sharp, uncompromising gold, Lily reached out, her hand resting not on his, but on the cold, polished glass of the railing, a gesture of ownership and contained power. The ultimate insight lay here. Survival demands adaptation, and sometimes the only way to truly make ends meet is to realize that the ends themselves are not predetermined points of comfort, but moving targets defined solely by the commitment to continue, side by side, masters of a demanding, dangerous narrative that was irrevocably their own. Their story concluded not with a gentle fade into retirement, but with an open-ended commitment to the relentless, unending battle for existence, armed only with strategic loyalty and the fierce, protective alloy of necessity.